Hey everybody, welcome. Yeah, let's do it. Great. I'm glad you're excited. Today we're talking about falsetto. Head voice, right, is also a synonym for that. Although we'll talk about how sometimes people use those two terms differently. And it's just tips and tricks and ways to get your head voice sounding better, stronger, extending the range. Um, it's just really an important register to develop in your voice. Just to talk about this, like, our chest voice register is what we use most of the time when we're speaking for most people. And so head voice just tends to get a little out of shape compared to the other register. And so if you're not using it and practicing it regularly, and then you start to try to use head voice, there's a lot of things that can kind of go wrong. Um, and just one interesting thing is, like, I live in Los Angeles, and so I'm often going to concerts and various things. And one thing I've noticed is head voice is being used more and more, and particularly for a lot of like DJ sets. Like sometimes with the DJs, they're doing all of their electronic work, but then they also have some vocals, which is a great way to kind of personalize your vibe and your aesthetic. And what I find is actually a lot of DJs and some of the recent concerts that I've gone to will use head voice as their primary sort of register as they're doing all of their other music. And I think that's actually really interesting. One, it's very efficient as a style if you get that, if you get sort of the right kind of technique. And so you can do it for long hours. And then the other thing is that I think it fits with the aesthetic of, hi, welcome. It fits with the aesthetic of, the lower sort of bass sounds, and then having kind of a more ambient sort of head voicey kind of sound tends to fit. So that's just something I've noticed as I've listening to artists and new music coming out. And so if that's your vibe, that's actually a really cool thing to do as a vocalist, is to learn all of your looping and electronics and things like that. Just a plug for, like, where do I sing with head voice and what kinds of styles? I find that's actually one that's becoming increasingly more and more popular. Uh, Obviously, contemporary music, there's lots of head voice usage. So, for some singers, like, doing country and some other things, you might find that you use your head voice less. But even if you're not using head voice as your primary style, it's really important for your overall technique and ultimately for your high chest voice. It helps you find the right kind of position and ease so that you don't get fatigued too fast. And then also, when you're sometimes marking things, if you can do a nice delicate head voice, it's a great way to test out where the range is, where your pitches are in your songs without having to full force it all the time. So there's lots of uses for head voice. So just gonna put that plug out there. Let's talk about what it is, because of course, hi, welcome. With registers, of course, it can be a little confusing. Like, am I using the right kind of register? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? As I always say, and I'll repeat it like a broken record, registration is a bit of a metaphor for something that's more complex. And it's not as, like, either or as people would like it to seem. There's obvious sort of changes from the bottom of our voice all the way up to the top. And we use different sort of strategies of resonance. And that's where we get this concept of chest voice and head voice. And it's defined more by the sensation or perception of that sound and resonance rather than uh, anything else, really. It's sort of can be confusing because it's defined by sensation. And we talk about chest voice and head voice. This isn't where they actually are located. It's all stuff that we do in our vocal tract. So this area, our resonators. So just, it's important to note, right? It's not like we're singing with our chest or singing with our head. That's just sort of a more sensation-based terminology. Think, I like to use this analogy, and I used this last week when I someone talked about mixing and registration a bit. It's kind of like gear shifts in a car a little bit, as we get to sort of different levels of frequency, and we have uh, just like higher waveforms in general. We just have a different strategy that's more efficient as we get to the top. So eventually, we do have to switch our strategy. But the whole point is that we have this sort of smooth spectrum, and often we're singing in between the two a lot of the time. So, just important sort of food for thought as we go into this. And thank you so much. Very cool. I'm glad you're enjoying all of this in this process. Head voice is something that I used to do and still do a lot of, but especially singing in like a male a cappella group. I was like the tippy top part. So we're often singing in a very high register. So I just remember it's something that, and this is my first tip. Hi, welcome. I'm so glad there's so many people showing up today. This is great. Um, so one of my first tips is like if you're new to singing in your head voice, be slow and patient about it because it's just the muscles take some time to get conditioned, and we're not using it all the time, right? So I found like when I was in season singing high head voice like all the time as like my main sort of like voice part in the a cappella group that I was singing in, uh, it would take me some time to really fill it out. And our temptation sometimes when our head voice doesn't feel very strong is to try and push, and we often run into certain kinds of habits, and we'll talk about those as well. And feel free to ask questions through all of this, and also talk about your own experience of like what it's like to develop your head voice. So it's really just about having a consistent practice, as always, right? And there are some tricks to finding your head voice. So one of the first ways in a very fast way that we can distinguish the difference between chest and head voice in kind of like a primitive sort of natural way is talking about how we call out or cheer or congratulate someone. So there's the hey style and there's the whoop style. And this is another way of talking about chest voice and head voice. If I'm calling out and I go like, hey, over there, that's, it's like a little shouty, right? A little abrasive. And it is more of our chest voice sound, right? It goes towards a little more of a megaphone kind of a thing. Now, the other style is to think about um, our whoop, right? So if you think of when you're cheering, you go, woo, woohoo, right? It's a totally different strategy. And you might try this out because you've probably done both of these styles before. That sort of whoop style is our head voice strategy. So we do this kind of naturally, right? That's just important to note. Some people talk about finding your head voice, thinking about like hooting like an owl or various kinds of imitation things, right? If you're like, whoo, 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 right? It feels like the sound comes in like this from above. That's true for a lot of people, but again, a perceptive term and the sensation of resonance, versus chest voice feeling like it kind of comes from below and out. So with chest voice, we tend to, the thing we want to avoid that's less musical is too much sort of a shouty sound. And with head voice, sometimes if sort of we go too far in that direction, we can get what we call like a squeak sound, right? Like, right. If you see that kind of like up and in sort of feeling, that's unsupported, and a less healthy sort of aspect of head voice. So just important to kind of note like what are the things that we're kind of avoiding. So these are sensations you can kind of follow. Hi, welcome. So let's start diving into some head voice work. Like how do we develop it? What are sort of the tricks to the trade with it? So I think one of the most important principles is it's finding the path of least resistance first. And I mean this in terms of not like as a technical term, but is in when you're conditioning your voice in whatever register, you want to find where it's easiest and what kinds of vowels and consonant shapes are easiest to find that registration or sound, and then go towards the harder and harder things, right? So um, that way you're incrementally conditioning your voice and you're less likely to overstrain or overcompensate in various ways. So the first thing we want to talk about with head voice is we find that more narrow vowels like e and oo are easier to access. And you'll actually find like as you look at a lot of music where people are going into head voice and falsetto, uh, a lot of the jumps actually go to an e or an oo vowel. And this might be just some of the intuitive processing of people trying to find songs that are catchy, but also that they can sing well and efficiently. So that's the first thing is in chest voice, we often find that like, or at least I find that ah and a and some of these bigger vowels are easier to access, and then e and oo can feel a little less natural. And then when we're in head voice, it's flipped around. It's e and oo vowels are a little easier to grasp. And as they get wider towards a's and ahs, it can be a little harder to maintain a solid head voice sound. And we'll talk about sort of some of the reasons why I think this is the case. Um, some of it has to do with one of the issues that we have with head voice, which is chord compression. So when we have bad chord compression with head voice, we tend to get this kind of very light, kind of hollow sound. And this often leads to a lot of sort of compensating issues. So, like, it sounds kind of like this. If I'm like, and it feels like all the air is escaping, we can't really support that sound and we can't get a lot of power. So people then start to kind of push and strain. Now, the hard thing about chord compression and anything that we're talking about are actual vocal folds and the larynx. Is that we can't really consciously control these things, these muscles in our larynx. And so, what we really have to do is use the right kinds of exercises that help us condition those muscles so that we get better core compression and then save the feeling for it. Um, yeah. Yes. So someone's mentioning that like singing a lot, right? That sometimes what's hard is all of a sudden the middle range gets really hard to use, and then actually our lower and higher register can be easier. And this is actually very common. In fact, it's important to note uh, that with our registration, it's often like head voice and chest voice is defined kind of by the dysfunction, as in they feel like more and more separate things when we have issues with the smooth transition from one to the other. We can use this stylistically, right, to have like an abrupt registration, but it's important to note that when our voice is getting tired, often the middle is where we start to get a gap and it's more unstable. And then we were able to kind of go a little higher, often not super high. And then same thing, we're able to sing in our chest voice, but there starts to become we start to have a gap between the two. So that's actually really important to note, right? Is what does it feel like when my voice is getting tired? Um, yes, so it does make a lot of sense actually based on what you were saying. And when we actually get a smoother transition between the two, that's often going to lead towards healthier singing. That's why it's so important to feel out and understand how your head voice is supposed to feel. Um, and then actually, the other thing is thinking about your registration as overlapping, right? It goes with this concept of it being more of a smooth spectrum, and that it's just like we want a smooth transition from one sort of resonant style to the other. And so if you think about extending your chest voice a little higher than where your head voice meets, and then actually being able to extend your head voice lower, this is one of the tips that we're going to talk about. That actually gives you more range and flexibility in the middle, where we tend to do a lot of our singing. So it's just unfortunate, right? We're actually like middle range is where we want to do a lot, but based on sort of voice science is where it can actually get a little more problematic. And when our voice is tired, it actually starts to eat away from the middle a lot of the time for people. Also, head voice in general can be a sign, if you're having trouble making any sort of pitches in head voice, it can be a sign of vocal fatigue as well, of course. So, yeah. Okay. And then I love this. So we have some more questions about, um, so, so you're saying like challenging yourself and high registers and all of this kind of stuff, right? There's actually like it's important to note that there's a little bit of like a mental barrier with high pitches in general. And I kind of want to help sort of break that. In fact, I often think about less of down and up. And I know that's sort of sometimes the sensation of resonance, but instead thinking about actually just expanding out and putting more energy into my sound to create stability and freedom and range of motion here so that our vocal folds can just properly adjust, or the muscles in our larynx can properly adjust to what we're doing. So when they get stuck, that's when we tend to run into issues. Um, and then this question about where we change from one to the other, from chest voice to head voice. This is range dependent. In fact, it's a great way to figure out where your voice type is where you start to switch from chest to head voice and where your break range is. And it does move around a little bit with time. And with training, you can learn to smooth it out altogether, but it still gives you a good sense of where your voice is. So that question I leave a little open ended. We'll go over some stuff as we're working on our exercises as well. So, as a tenor, for example, my chest voice can extend a little higher than a baritone singer. And then my head voice transition is going to be a little bit higher as well. And so you just have to feel this out, and we'll go through this. How do we feel the sensation of being in chest voice or head voice? Great, I'm so glad. This is it's really really important. And a lot of times I get like sometimes when people submit videos or new students, a lot of times people are using registration terms, and I'm like, that's actually doesn't sound like your head voice, or it doesn't sound like your chest voice. So this can actually take a little bit of exploring. It's nice to have a teacher. But part of the reason why it's sort of confusing again is because it's not just an easy and or, there's more of a smooth sort of connection that we want. It's all really one voice, and we can really hear an abrupt transition when, unless we're doing it intentionally, we can hear abrupt transition when it's not working as well as we'd like. And cracking, right, when our voice does like, it's often flicking between the two styles and sometimes gets stuck between the two, right? We call those sort of the like yodeling kind of moments, right? Cracking can be used as an advantageous tool for certain style things, but if we're not in control of it and we try to use the wrong sort of shape with our vocal folds, and we're not sure how it feels one to the other, that's when we fall into cracking when we don't want it to happen. So it's actually our body trying to protect itself. When we try to put the wrong sort of force into it, with the wrong shape, it'll kind of abruptly switch out of our control. Um, that's actually better than the alternative, which is holding it and trying to really stick into it. That's when we get the less healthy techniques in general, is when our muscles get more static and we're forcing it into a position. So oftentimes I encourage students to get comfortable with cracking, understand it, don't feel embarrassed by it. In fact, learn how to do it on purpose, and sometimes that helps that whole thing go away as we understand sort of what it feels like when we're falling into a crack versus not. Uh, so let's talk a little bit about how we work our chord compression, kind of coming full circle again. Um, it's hard for us to the actually get support on our head voice because of this chord compression issue. Think of it like the vocal folds. In chest voice, it's very easy for them to push together. And in head voice, sometimes it's the opposite issue, where it's hard for them to fully come together. And it's, sometimes again, this sort of mental concept of it being high and light and those kinds of sensations. And so one thing we want to actually practice first is being able to get more of a clear, clean tone in our head voice, so that we can learn how to build volume into our sound. Because I think a lot of the times what happens when we're switching into head voice is it feels too light or breathy, or sort of not as connected to our chest voice, and might lose like emotional uh, presence sometimes, right? I mean, obviously, sometimes we want that kind of breathier thing, and we'll talk about that a little later. So the trick with chord compression, there's a couple things you can do. One of them is using a glottal sound. So for those of you who follow this more regularly, this is going to be a little bit of repetition, but we'll add some other things in as we go that hopefully you haven't done as much before. So with a glottal, think of this sound of going g or uh uh, or sometimes Camille will do this one where she goes oh, because it stops twice. The oh is kind of like a natural sort of intuitive way that we do this. And then notice when you do that, that feeling of the vocal folds coming together. Now don't over pulse it, but g, g, g. There's this little bit of a moment where it presses. We use those exercises, or we use G's, that kind of sound in our exercises, to get a better sense of when our vocal folds are coming together and save that muscle memory. So that's why when I'm working with head voice, one of the first things I'll have people do is try to make that G sound. And think of this as literally like doing exercises for those muscles. So you just want to do it for a few minutes every time you practice. And over time, you're going to get better chord compression. And then we'll talk about actually using your support once you have that. So we go like this, like that g, g, g. And it might feel kind of unstable, a little like tricky at first. Again, you might crack, but just trust kind of leaning into that a little more. G, g, g. And again, I'm using like an E vowel or an oo vowel, and that's going to help. And then really allow your jaw to stay a little more loose and relaxed. You don't have to really, really open the space intensely, but it's really more about feeling a little more resonance from the back. It tends to be that case for people and their perception of resonance. And we feel a little bit of this vertical stretch. So the vocal tract itself kind of has a different shape that we want to get into when we're doing head voice. So I like to think of just chest voice as a little more broad like this, and head voice is a little more narrow. So we want this kind of internal stretch. So as we're doing this, you might feel that out and go like, "Gee, gee, 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 gee." And it's really from that inside sort of space. So head voice kind of looks like you're a little more like a ventriloquist than chest voice, because again, it's not our typical sort of speech voice function. So it feels like a little less natural for people. So I would do this for a little bit, like "Gee, gee, 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 gee," just to condition the muscles. And I'm listening for that nice sort of higher overtone that comes with head voice. So "Gee, gee, 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 gee," that little sort of sparkling, high, sort of slightly piercing sound, is the kind of resonance we want. It's really interesting. I sometimes mention this overtone analyzing app. The one that I like to use is called Spectrum View, and it's free on iPhones. And if you try singing in chest voice and look at the overtones, you'll see that they have a different arrangement, right? They're kind of closer together a lot of the time. And then you go to head voice and you see that they're more spaced out, the overtones. So um, it's another way of visualizing sort of what's happening with the more complex concept of resonance and sort of changing our resonance strategy. Again, you can go down that sort of rabbit hole, and it's very heady about acoustics, but we want to feel that sensation. Um, yeah. So I don't quite know what you mean by are you hitting your change note? But explain more, and maybe I can address that. So you want to just find somewhere, in the middle of your head voice range. So for me, I'm doing this above middle C, and this in this case, I was doing E, F sharp, and G sharp, like "gee, gee, 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 gee." For a lot of lower male vocalists, your head voice is going to be probably between that middle C and this higher C. That's 4 and 5. It's funny. I always have to count from the back. I don't know. I don't use the numbers as often. I just think of where middle C is. That's just a little silly, but it's going to be probably around there. So if you're a lower voice singer, you might be like "key, key, 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 key," or even as low as like an A. "Key, key, 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 key." Um, and it might be a little higher for you. Now I can bring my chest voice higher than where I was doing that up here, but it's a good place to start for head voice. They overlap again, right? It's more of like a spectrum rather than just one or the other. So we want to do that kind of G sound. That's going to really help get some chord compression, and you're listening for that overtone, that higher sort of resonance. Often that's why people talk about it as like head voice. It feels like it kind of floats in from your head. You can sometimes feel it if you put your hand here, sort of the higher vibrations in the back of your head. But it's more of a perception kind of a thing. Now let's talk about how we condition our head voice. So once we get that feeling of the right chord compression, you're going to feel a little bit of that pulsing sensation in your belly, and that's our abdominal support, right? It's less about physical force and more about coordination and feeling the right kinds of sensations. So as I'm doing that, like g g key 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 key, I might start to feel a little bit of that kind of pulsing sensation. It kind of leaning out as I go higher and relaxing as it goes lower. I'll often do this exercise back to back with going like and this is where I'm really trying to feel that support connection. It's sort of like a small siren, right? For some people, if that feels like a little too controlled and specific, you can just do a looser siren and be like, kind of feel it like that. But I'll do these back to back. I'll use the like key, 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 key to feel the placement and then put the power into it. Again, I'm just trying to let this all kind of hang, and just looks kind of like like I'm a puppet master or something, right? It's coming more from the back. So I'll do this for a bit and I'll go like gee, 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 gee. So I think, and we'll go a little bit into sort of the mental thing about this. I think what happens sometimes, head voice, because it sounds light and kind of floaty, it feels really disconnected from our support mechanism. At least it seems like that. So people tend to just not support it at all, and they're like, "Wee, wee," and you'll see that kind of same sort of pinchy, kind of squeaky kind of look. There's other things that can happen, of course, too, but I find that to be really, uh, really common. Uh, yes. Oh, good, good, good. I'm glad that I answered that question. Yes, they can overlap. And in fact, it's really good to feel out how they overlap because that can give you more choices and options in the middle of your voice, and controlling dynamics often has to do with registration a lot of the times, mechanically, more so than anything else, right? You can really hear like the quality change, and that sometimes makes us think of louder and softer. And it kind of goes with the concept of what I'm talking about right now, which is our perception of the resonance can sometimes can confuse us. We're still going higher in our voice, and higher pitches require more support energy, and that doesn't necessarily mean louder. But people tend to under support their head voice, and that's a big issue where we start to get fatigue from it. You want to make sure that you still have lower abdominal breath support. And again, that cord compression issue adds to it, right? If we're not getting that, the air is all escaping and we just can't create stability. And then the muscles around our larynx and everything try to hold it together, right? And that's that kind of squeaky thing that happens. We want to avoid that. We want these muscles to stay relaxed and for the vocal folds to really stay together because of that balance of pressure and the right kind of resonance, that creates pressure on the other side, just keeps them flapping. So really, we're always trying to get out of the way here. Um, and I think in head voice, people lose connection to their lower abdominal support. They feel kind of disconnected. In fact, I remember my teacher back in college, who was like a opera singer, soprano, and she would always talk about how like when you're getting it right, and I'm assuming she probably means more for head voice a lot of the time, and they feel kind of disconnected. And I think what she means is you're not like uh, muscling it from here, right? It's just that your belly drops and there's support, and then head voice just floats in from the other side. So you kind of have to trust it. You have to pick it out of the air, is something that she would also say all the time. And a lot of it has to do with just setting up and relaxing here. Uh, really making sure that you're leading with that lower abdominal support, so that you don't start to compensate. So when I do these WEU things, it's like I'm doing a little bit of like a weightlifting sort of bench press to make sure that my support is connected to that process. As I go higher, I feel it engage. As it goes lower, it relaxes. Now, I think it's important to kind of note why this is so confusing sometimes is because when we're in our high chest voice, it's a high part of that register. It's kind of like the gear shifting thing. It's running at full steam. And then when we switch strategies and we're at our low head voice, which is around the same sort of area, it's a little below our high chest voice sometimes, right? It sort of overlaps. That area doesn't require as much energy. And so it's a different strategy. And then as we go higher in our head voice, it requires more and more support energy as we go up, and that gear is really working at that RPM. Again, I'm using that sort of analogy. So because there's an overlap, low head voice can feel really easy and doesn't need that much breath pressure. And then high chest voice actually needs more. So when we're jumping back and forth, the exchange of energy can feel kind of complicated. Hopefully that's not too, I didn't, that's a hard thing to explain, but as we go through it, hopefully you'll understand this a little more. And so I'm talking about just purely in head voice. As we go up higher and higher, we want to feel more of that engagement. Now, when we go to A and O and Ah, they tend to be a little harder to keep that chord compression. At least this is what I find. Um, and so that's why I like to start with E and Oo. It's easier to get those high overtones. And then as we go to A and O and Ah, we want to try and save the feeling of where that comes from. So E and U, it feels more natural, But when we do A and O, it feels kind of like oftentimes people will get sort of stuck and they'll start to crack or drop back into chest voice. And we want to sort of feel a new placement of these vowels in head voice. So if you haven't been doing a lot of head voice, this takes a sec to feel out. And that's why I use the other things to get there. So I would do like my gee, 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 and then wee, wee, and then I start to weight train my head voice going into way oh, and try not to way spread this way because it's gonna maybe pull you back down and you're gonna feel more strained. But instead, thinking a little more vertical, and it feels like it's a little more tucked back here. So you see how I'm trying to use that E sound and that resonance is sort of like a scaffolding for where my A and O should feel, where I should feel that sort of resonating from. And so I kind of work myself up this way. I'll do wee wayo, and then eventually get to ah, and the ah feels like a little bit of like a hat back here again, using perceptive terms, but like versus wah, ah. Um, uh, yeah, using the woo, right? That's also yeah, exactly. So all of these are helpful. Again, I'm going from like wee oo, and you can flip them back and forth however you like, going to a o and then to ah, and I'm using that e to help me feel out those harder vowels that require a little more support and chord compression to get right. So I'll do this back to back, and it might take you time, right? You might feel like for a number of practices, you feel good on E and oo, and it's getting better and better. But A and O is really bad. Oh, no worries. Yeah, I was like, I can't quite understand what you said, and that's probably because of a typo. So no worries. So yeah, I will often start with that, and then you might, again, I mentioned like when I'm like getting into shape with head voice, and I haven't been doing a lot of that singing, give it some days, like practice EU and get that really comfortable, and then try AO, and then try WA like a little later on. Sometimes again, as we're trying to find the right place, we might start to squeeze and force things. We'll talk about some tension things that can happen. But this is the process, right? Is going from like EU to AO to WA. I find is a nice flow. So in like I like to do repetitions so I get another chance to feel coming on and off of it. And then and actually, here's another thing I forgot to mention, but oftentimes people are on just sort of the lower side of support with their head voice because they're singing more in that straight tone sort of place. And I encourage you actually to try and find a fully supported vibrato head voice, right? That means that you're really leaning into it, right? Like, it really shows you that you're actually getting in there. So that's something that I encourage. It does take some time. So that's one practice. And then I would say we're talking about sort of extending our head voice higher. I would say it's equally important to feel out low head voice. This is where people tend to crack actually a lot. So switch it around and let's drop, we'll change the interval, but try dropping like a fifth from your more middle head voice to lower head voice. So this is where it gets tricky, right? We want to make sure we're not over supporting our lower head voice sounds. So I might take a similar vowel shape thing and go like, feel that very, very delicate head voice and descend down this way and be like, and try to stay in head voice. So, right, I could at this point already be like, and jump into a more chest voice sound. But instead, just keep it really light, really, really low volume is fine. So, it's, take it down. eventually it'll probably just effortlessly switch. So for me, that was already about like by like an A below middle C. And you'll start to notice, hey, that head voice, is that chest voice. At a certain point, it's gonna switch strategies, but we're trying to find that really smooth kind of fader from one to the other. Um, and knowing where, you know, knowing where it kind of bottoms out can really help you understand your voice better. So I recommend that. You might do the other vowels, right? Going like, yeah, this is often I'm thinking about the process of like what it's like when you're learning your voice. And so for most people, this is going to be a natural process, which is you're going to feel like your two registers are distinct, and you can develop them a little separately. And naturally, your body will start to find the transition points. So eventually, right, I sometimes do this slide from A to E, chest voice to head voice. And I'm just trying to find that smooth sort of C shape, right? Going like, and that just comes with practice, and you'll find that there's a break range when your voice is more tired, and it'll smooth out over time as you start to do this kind of stuff. We almost want to confuse ourselves a little bit. We want to sometimes, yeah, I want to know distinct registration, but oftentimes I'm just kind of like, I don't fight it. I want it to go where it's going to be more effortless, and not be like so stuck with the terminology. But there's a learning process, right? Which is like we need to distinguish sort of differences in shape and resonance and all these more complicated things with something that's a little more like generic, right? And that's head voice and chest voice. But it's kind of an oversimplification, and that's kind of my point. Is I think this is just natural in teaching, right? We have to start with a simpler, easy to grasp concept, and then be like, but wait, there's more. But wait, it's more complicated, and get more and more refined from there. So as we're learning our voice, I think you can go through a similar process. Um, Here's another one that I like to use. So when we're working on all of this, a lot of what's important is also feeling good alignment. So if our head and our neck is already coming out like this and chest voice a lot, right, and that shouty sound, it's really hard to connect it up with that head voice feeling. And so often this is where people start. They're used to shouting and being in their chest voice, and then head voice is like, right, because I can't actually get that resonance, but it'll actually get harder and harder to do that when my alignment comes out of place. So one thing I'll do is use like an NG sound to feel that alignment. In fact, often when I'm training chest voice, I'm already trying to get people to feel that, right? And we talk about posture as one of the first things on the checklist, right? Is making sure you've got flexibility here. And sort of I talk to people about how when we sing in chest voice a lot and we're overcompensating and doing a lot of belting, we get stuck like this, and that just makes for a lot less efficiency in our voice, more of a forced sound. And so we're already kind of practicing mixing and sort of finding that transition from the very beginning. But often I'll find that the NG kind of sound will help you really feel that alignment. So you can practice sliding around on an NG in head voice and go like, I wouldn't go all the way up, but see if you can keep that stability, right? Like, it shows you that it's less about like, oh, you need to open your mouth wider, and more about having the right kind of alignment and release of the muscle. So the tongue coming up to the soft palate can help us sometimes find that. So I'll do this exercise sometimes. And again, it's funny trying to come up with these exercises because we want to sing stuff that we can sing over and over again. That doesn't sound like too weird of a mantra. So a lot of times they're just like vowels and consonants, so it doesn't feel as like attached to a meaning. But it's important also to practice word shapes. So whenever I have an NG, it's a chance to feel that alignment, And a good way of practicing sometimes is feeling the alignment without actually being there yet. So I'll do this exercise like this. I'll go like sing, sing, and get that NG, and then sing freely. And I'm doing a lot of things here. I'm practicing popping up to that nice tall E, feeling some support engagement, and then practicing descending back down into my head voice. So you might find that you start mixing. You might start and be like, sing a little more chesty, sing freely. And then you can use that NG, that moment, to kind of surf the waveforms and feel out where your placement should be to target where your head voice is going to come in. So, yeah. So I'm talking about alignment and kind of like targeting. Like you can actually feel good alignment lower in your voice and then pop up to head voice. So in this case, like sing freely with that NG down here. Ing, nga, 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 I can actually help me feel where I'm about to go ahead of time. Because often we crack when we transition and we put the wrong shape in the wrong position, right? So this is another one you can practice. And then we're also working on descending back down. You can play around with going back to chest voice, or you can go just in head voice the whole time. So it can be like, sing freely. And just try to stay in that same position, right? Sing freely. So kind of what I'm showing is we can take something that's easier to stay in the right register and start to work ourselves towards stuff that's sometimes a little more challenging. And in that way, practice saving the muscle memory and negotiate things more and more as we get sort of deeper into our practice. And so targeting things ahead of time before you get there takes a little bit of muscle memory practice, right? So I find that one's good. Just saying sing freely. Yeah. Also, I'm using that F as like a free, free. It kind of helps get the air flowing for people. So sometimes these are tricks that we'll do. Um, so that's this idea. This can be kind of hard for people because we're in a smaller interval. Another thing I recommend practicing is jumping from chest voice to head voice, but think of a wider interval, like an octave. Um, and you can practice doing the same kind of alignment thing, different consonants. I might do like a na and go like na ni ah. I'm practicing that switch. Na 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 ni ah. Ah, ee, ah. And then eventually you can just do it with pure vowels. But I'm sort of explaining a little bit about what happens when we're really singing words. Is we're flicking between vowels and consonants, and we can use these as moments to actually feel the transitions and kind of like a magician, sort of hide those transitions a little bit so that it just comes out as this very smooth focus. So that can be a practice. Again, I'm going from an ah to an e or an ah to an oo, and it's going to get harder as you do like ah to a. I was doing actually in this case like an A. This is A3 to A4. Na, ni, ah. So you could do that. You could also na, ni, ah. Right, that's going to be a little bit higher up, but I recommend for most people, it's good to try and get up to that C5. Na, ni, ah. And your practice is a overall kind of fitness thing to keep it really in shape. So it's a goal for some people. Some people will come more naturally. Just doing an octave jump here. You can challenge yourself by making wider jumps, which strangely starts to get harder because it just feels really disconnected sometimes, right? It's hard to sort of approximate how much support and how much energy you need to put into it. But I'll do this kind of exercise and be like, na 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 nee, and then just try to do it without any of the sort of tricks like the using an N or an NG. Um, so that can be a really great practice as well. Sometimes I'll do slower sort of arpeggiating, right, where I go like and that starts to work a little more of our mixing kind of a style. But one of my big points that I wanted to get to is the best way to learn mixing is to get really comfortable with both registers and to really condition them so that you can make a nice handoff from one to the other. And then eventually it just becomes such a smooth transition that you can't really tell the difference, right? We're going from like a more thick chord compression in chest voice, thinner in head voice. And, lo and behold, when they're talking about mixing, they're finding there's somewhat of a middle connection, right? Where it's not as much surface area as chest voice is not, and it's not quite as light as head voice. And so we're working on our ability to keep that connection, that chord compression as it's transitioning and changing shape. Again, that's what's happening in the vocal folds. We can't really feel it, but we know it when we hear it, and we can feel indirectly when things aren't working well because of tension or cracking or some of these other kinds of things. So that's that side of the practice. Um, Hopefully that's all making sense. But I don't want to try and reinvent the wheel. But doing this kind of stuff and filling around with it is going to really help you understand your voice. And a lot of people, if you're just singing in chest voice all the time, it's like you only know half of your voice. So all of a sudden, your high chest voice feels like the end when it's really just the middle. And that can really help you find the right kind of alignment and effortlessness as you go up into these higher places, right? Like an F here above middle C, I could be like, "Ee," or I can be ya, ah, ee, and I could go back and forth, and then eventually I can find like yeah, right, where it starts to feel just soft and delicate from the middle. Yeah, so it's kind of like when you think about chest voices, it starts to get kind of louder and more abrasive, and then it's as we're going higher and higher, head voice on the bottom end is so light and hollow that there's this sort of it feels too abrupt. So what we want to do is make our chest voice comfortable enough that we can and start to transition towards the back, that it makes a very smooth transition to head voice. And then we try to fill out our head voice with better chord compression so that we can get more of a solid sound, so that by the time we transition, it's solid on either side or it's soft on either side, whatever we're going for. So light mixing or belt mixing, right? And something in the middle. Um, so I think head voice is kind of an essential, obviously, aspect of singing that everyone should feel out in their voice, even if you don't use it in your actual performance. So that's that side of things. And you can, once you understand the principles about all of this, you can actually start to create your own exercises. And that's ultimately what I want people to get out of this is that if you understand how your voice works, you can continually start to challenge it more or know how to relax it and pull it back into balance if it's gone sort of out in the wrong direction. And so once you start to know those cues and those triggers, you learn to control your voice better, right, and understand what's going on. So yeah, that's that concept. Um, One thing I wanted to mention was because this is titled like falsetto tips, and it's really important to speak about this I find online too when I look this stuff up because I'm always curious what other people are saying, that people get the registration kind of wrong. Like they put falsetto like above head voice. And tell me if you think this is wrong, but falsetto is not. It's sort of like a term that people used for often like guys singing in head voice because it was less common to sing in head voice for a while, and it was like singing more in chest voice. And it's actually nowadays it refers more towards like a stylistic choice. Often I think of falsetto as a light, less supported and breathier toned head voice, and it's kind of in the lower end actually. By the time you go up higher and higher, if you're unsupported with your head voice, it's going to lead to some of those squeaking issues and other problems. So as you go higher, like you need to support it more. Although as you get really good at doing this, you might be able to find a nice sort of ease and effortlessness. But I find falsetto kind of comes from the like boy bandy kind of sound. which is a very light, breathy head voice. Now, this is where it's funny with stylistic things. Like I talked about this whole time about getting better chord compression in general. Once we understand how to do that, we can break the rules a little more. And this is where stylistic choices come into play. I think if you just jump right to sort of like light, breathy head voice phonation, you might run into some cracking issues actually. So I think the key to finding this nice, sort of light, soft falsetto style is actually to train your head voice so that you're more comfortable with this range. And actually, as I talked about last time, working on your lower head voice and extending it down allows you to get more of that sort of soft control. So we're talking about like you might take something where we were going here and be like, so and then you're gonna start to widen it out and be like, we are, hey, yeah. And then it can effortlessly go from more chest voice to ah. That's going to help you, although you can see there's some limitations, right? Like as we're doing breathier stuff, you're going to run out of air faster. Um, and this kind of brings me full circle to like the DJ sound sometimes is that like ba-da-da-da, fa-da-da-da, and then they add like reverb and are often through an amplified kind of thing. Um, so just to show you, that's I think what when people are talking about like falsetto as a style, it's that like you might be singing here and be like, and yeah, get like a certain kind of vulnerable quality, right? Sometimes it comes with a little bit of cracking. Like I know like Ed Sheeran sometimes does that kind of sound, right? Where it's like, nah, nay. And so you can kind of find sort of that spectrum of things. Um, that's sort of my 2 cents on what falsetto kind of singing is like. Uh, Sometimes maybe defined by like also the dysfunction of like guys who were singing in chest voice and experimenting with more head voice singing and doing it in a less supported way. So you can practice just trying to sort of reverse engineer this, like go from more chord compression, like and then add a little more H to the sound. And explore sort of the different kinds of timbres that come out of that. Na, eh, ah. So that's sort of the game. And it's really the point being is like there aren't wrong answers. It's just about understanding what rules you're breaking and why, and knowing what's risky and what isn't, and what actually will help condition your voice. Versus, based on the voice science, versus what's a little more like cheating, so to speak, right? So I don't like to tell people like this is the right way to sing and this is the wrong way to sing. It's just like, do you have the right strategy for what you're trying to sing? And is it harmful or is it keeping your voice kind of nourished so that you actually can continue to sing from day to day, right? So that's always the thing. Technique is what works. And there's lots of different techniques for different things that people are trying to express with their art. Um, yeah. So that's the thing is like, so these questions of like, can you have a good vibrato in falsetto? It's harder probably. But, ah, hey. It's going to be lighter, right? Because you know you could practice it, but I'm sure you could get a decent vibrato, but it's not going to be like the full supported vibrato that comes with singing with like more chord compression. Because really, vibrato is like the way that our larynx protects itself from pressure building up. So if I'm like and I'm able to keep this area more relaxed, it's going to start to kind of oscillate like that. If I'm, it's probably going to be a little less pronounced, right? So you can definitely sing with vibrato like that. but it's going to sort of fit with how much pressure you're using, right? It's going to sound like a little more laid back and a little softer, probably. But that's actually a really good question. You And then the question of how do you know you're in head voice or falsetto? That's kind of like they're the same, right? It's just a matter of like a stylistic quality. So oftentimes I use those terms interchangeably, and I often will more just say head voice and talk about like a light, breathy head voice and sort of separate out the parameters a little bit more for the elements of style rather than like now I'm switching from my falsetto to my head voice. I think that's maybe too much of like splitting hairs. Uh, but you can kind of hear it by the quality and maybe the genre or style that you're singing. So you might say like, I want a more like falsetto-y kind of sound rather than like a fully supported head voice. Um, uh, so okay, let's talk about this. So we're saying get control over your muscles above the solar plexus. Um, so you're talking about like trying like support that's happening from the chest or from the upper abdominals. And that area, yeah, it can be a bad habit. That means that you're kind of squeezing in and often pushing your air out, which can lead to inefficiency. So um, I would recommend that if you're doing that kind of a thing, is one, trying to work on your lower abdominal support and that isolation. And as you're doing that, you can put your hand by your upper abs and just, yeah, it's a bad habit. I think that's a good way of explaining it. So this is what's hard about talking about the voice in general is like techniques work. Um, it's it's like you can make the voice build pressure that way, but it comes with consequences, right? So this kind of comes to my like, like the typical vocal technique stuff versus like stylistic things that we want to accomplish so that we can have a certain quality of our sound, which is valid, right? Like we don't all want to come out sounding like we're like opera singers. We're like, I can get like a real solid sound that way, and it's very effortless. But it sounds like that. So like that's you're only gonna have one kind of sound. It's like I can paint in this one kind of color, and it's like I don't have all the other things or textures, like more of a pastel kind of sound. Um, but the other ones come with habits. So that one in general, I think is I would say you don't really have to do it all because you can make similar kinds of sounds with a much more efficient technique. So that's why I consider it more of a habit. Like you'll see sometimes these videos where people are like, "Look at me go," and I can go like, "Ah," and they're like squeezing in like that, and it's like it leads to discomfort because you're restricting your breath, so it can actually lead to kind of feeling like a little lightheaded. And two, yeah, it's pushing all your air out. So it works for a second, and then you might have problems later on in your phrasing because you've lost all of your fuel, so to speak, to do that sort of technique. Um, yeah, the big squeeze. So actually, I recommend that you can gently kind of tap this area of your upper abdominals as you're singing, and it might, popping out is not as bad. That happens often. Um, but you might actually just kind of give it a little bit of a rub and try to keep it softer there, which is weird. That's Think of it like that's where our diaphragm really sits, right? Is between the arch of our ribs, and we want our diaphragm just like our vocal fold process. We want it to be able to kind of work on its own a little more. It's largely more of a subconscious process with that stuff. Like when people are like I've heard you're supposed to sing with your diaphragm, and it's like uh it's a part of breathing, but we don't really have good sensory innervation there. Like they've shown that we can actually kind of flex one half or the other, but that's kind of neither here nor there for singing technique. We want it to just be able to adjust uh, by more of a soft focus kind of flow. Same thing with the muscles in our vocal folds and our throat. That stuff is going to be adjusting more subconscious than uh, yeah. So that's um that's sort of the concept there. And we actually want to get out of the way here, just like we want to get out of the way here a lot of the time. So we want our diaphragm to be able to appropriately function. Otherwise, if you're squeezing there, think about how it can't rest and recover with our breath, and then it has to come back down and be active. And you want it to actually do that, right? Otherwise, it's going to get stuck. So, what I recommend is you push on this area. You might find that it affects your singing in a weird way. Like if I'm like, it kind of pushes that, and you'll notice that it has a direct effect because it's part of the system. But I want it to be like that's really hard, and it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Like I felt like a little bit of engagement there is kind of popping out a little bit, but that's something you can check in with actually and make sure that you're not over engaging there. So uh, so that's the you're talking about the opera falsetto. I love that. Yeah, right. It's kind of a that would be like almost like a like I don't because to me opera sounds like fully supported head voice, and so like opera falsetto sounds almost like a contradictory term, right? Like falsetto is kind of more of like a poppy kind of technique, and so I would say like if you're singing opera, it's like right, and it's because like opera music is about carrying in a often non-amplified setting where you just need to sing out and it's loud and louder, and the quality is more about like character, right? A lot of times, uh, but like falsetto is going to be more of like a light, sort of sandy, kind of foggy sound. That often happens in more ambient style music, right? So again, that's why I was like electronic music, DJ sets sometimes actually have a lot of falsetto usage nowadays, which I find sounds really good and is a very effortless technique for people. Um, so anyways, yeah, but actually I kind of like opera falsetto sounds like a group or something like that, right? Like I guess. Anyways, that's sort of my idea with all of this on head voice stuff. Um, you can eventually extend your head voice quite high. I'm not an expert with whistle tone singing. That's a whole other thing. Uh, but that's actually what's above sort of our typical head voice phonation. So yeah, hopefully this kind of helps talk about the process. One thing I just before we go, I'd like to mention that's I think really important. Speaking of like habits, if you're finding like you're struggling a lot with head voice, watch what your tongue is doing. Oftentimes, our tongue can be a barrier from one registration to the other and can cause a lot of cracking. When we belt a lot, the tongue can get really rigid. Uh, think about it like when we sing head voice, what happens for a lot of people once they finally get their jaw to relax a little bit, the tongue tries to pull back, and it sort of gets stuck in the throat sometimes for people. When I do like troubleshooting, we'll talk about this more specifically, but try to keep your tongue loose and a little bit more in the front like this. Like the back is working, it's making vowel shapes and things like that, but you can actually just think of sticking your tongue out a little more, be like right versus like it'll kind of pull back for people. It's hard for me to even demonstrate that because I've trained that out because it's sometimes it's going to really block things up. But watch that if that's something that you're noticing, if like you're going through this whole thing and you're like, man, I still can't get my head voice to work. Um, it might be because your tongue's pulling back and trying to squeeze the space that way. So keep it a little more floppy in the front. That's why people talk about that. And sometimes think out the back molars with the back part, and that helps us just keep it a little more level. So I think like it helps us actually direct the jaw, and in general, it's going to help remove some of the tension that might be blocking your resonance from your head voice. And so that can also be something that is like a game changer for people. So I'm glad I remembered to put that tip in at the last second. But we'll do more of these, of course, in the future. And I'm glad you guys liked it. Great, awesome. So I think Camille's up for the next few weeks, and then I'll be back in a couple weeks. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you all next time. All right. Take care.